Magick and Hypnosis, annotated in 1999 by the author, by Carol Poke Runyon, M.A., copyright 1977, 1999 by Carol Runyon. This article first appeared in Llewellyn Publications' Gnostica, Volume 5, Number 9, Hole Number 45. This article, the author takes the position that hypnosis is the operative technique of ceremonial magic. Visions of spirits appearing in the triangle of art are actually archetypes evoked from the deep mind via hypnotic induction. As a practicing magician specializing in these methods, he gives an insider's perspective upon how magic really works. I recently received a letter from a man who claimed to be an investigator of paranormal phenomenon, and after a few introductory remarks, he came quickly to the point. Can you demonstrate that the techniques you practice and teach are authentic and effective and not merely hypnotic and illusory? My reply was somewhat blunt. Ceremonial magic is a valid art, not a pseudoscience, I wrote. Certainly its visions are hypnotic, and they are no more illusory than are the Jungian archetypes in the collective unconscious, which in fact is exactly what they are. Their existence cannot be proved or disproved in a high school physics lab. I posted my answer with a sense of satisfaction. But in the days that followed, I began to realize that there was a great deal more involved in this question than could be answered in one clever paragraph. The present occult revival had been underway for a decade, but there are still only a few people who actually practice ceremonial magic. And this situation persists in spite of hundreds of different books on the subject in constant circulation. Now, why is this? The reason is that many, if not more, of our modern occultists are just as naive about the true nature of magic as was my correspondent. Ceremonial magic is ritual hypnosis. As Dion Fortune put it, magic is the art of causing changes in consciousness to occur in accordance with the will. The reason why so many people practice magic is not that there are a few students of the art, there are thousands, but that only a few know the real secret. Granted, there are a number of magicians who grudgingly concede this hypnotic definition, but in order to be successful, I feel that you should embrace the concept. By taking such a plunge, you simultaneously improve your technique, confirm your results, compound your critics, and make an honest person of yourself. And don't worry about betraying some great tradition. Magic was always hypnotic. Don't worry about being scientific. Scientists don't know what hypnosis is, and most of them will admit that they don't. Now, the basic business of the magician. If magic was always hypnotic, and if the Kabbalah always taught that the inner microcosm was the key to personal transformation, then why, for the past 100 years, have we been skipping over or completely ignoring the fundamental principles of magic? Lost in a maze of quasi-Masonic initiations and quasi-Freudian sexual speculations, we have forgotten that the basic business of the magician is to command spirits, in effect, components of his personality. He summons them to visible appearance and then compels them to perform tasks for him. Well, that's what he used to do back in the Renaissance times, but our more recent Victorian forebearers of the Golden Dawn were not able to reconstruct the old method of magical evocation because they refused to accept its hypnotic basis. Certainly there is more to magic than evocation, but that's where it starts. in the magic mirror of Yesod, with the ritual of the Goetia of the Lemegeton, and this hypnotic system, if properly employed in the Jungian psychoanalytic process of individuation, can be a cornerstone of successful lodge work. Before we discuss the characteristics of magical hypnosis, we need to look a little more deeply into the historical and philosophical reasons why this essential principle of the art has been overlooked and underrated. The Victorian and Edwardian magicians were more reactionary and superstitious, relatively speaking, than their Renaissance counterparts. They bequeathed to us a legacy of quaint and whimsical ideas about magic. We still find ourselves grappling with their outdated conceptions of secret chiefs who come from an astral world that might as well be on another planet. Hypnosis was a dirty word in this Victorian fairyland, not because it was scientific, but because it was subjective. In this case, the tendency to objectify magical phenomena is characteristic of philosophical dualism. It would be recalled that the dualist believed God to be separate from his creations, whereas the monist holds that God is present in all things. Now, for a more lengthy discussion of these ideas, see my negative versus positive Gnosis in Gnostica number 40. Now, the kingdom of God is within. At this point, the romantic reader may be experiencing something of a letdown. Am I saying that angels, demons, goddesses, and gods of old are only fragments of the individual imagination? Certainly not. The gods are real and their power is awesome. Hypnosis is the key to entering their kingdom of Olam Yazira, the astral plane. But we must realize that this other dimension begins within ourselves, in our subconscious minds. If we go deep enough, we venture beyond our own personal dreams into what Carl Jung called the collective unconscious, that vast realm where the archetypal gods abide. Make no mistake about it, the collective unconscious is a reality that goes beyond anyone's individual conception of it. It contains the entire history of the human race and probably the destiny of mankind as well. It is certainly linked to the Anima Mundi, the world soul earth goddess of the Renaissance magicians. I hold that its sensitivities extend throughout the solar system, and I suspect that it intrinsically related to the DNA code. These ideas are philosophically monistic, in characteristic with the teachings of Hermes Trismegistus and the doctrines of the Kabbalah. When the student fully grasps the significance of the collective unconscious in relation to the Hermetic Kabbalah, he will not need to ask such questions as Carlos Castaneda put to Don Juan, did I really fly? The objective versus the subjective argument will no longer involve a value judgment, but only a matter of relative perception. This may be a difficult hurdle for more to leap, but the rewards are infinite. The dualist seeking objective phenomenon, for example, photographic ghosts, apparitions formed from ectoplasm and the like, is certainly in danger of disillusionment. The more he tries to justify his beliefs, the more irrational he becomes. For him, occultism is a long downward spiral away from the intellectual position, whereas if properly pursued on a monistic subjective principle, the study and practice of magic should expand and extend the consciousness, thereby improving the intellect. The reader might agree with most of what I have said, and yet still raise the question, well, what about Aleister Crowley? Wasn't he subjective in his approach to magic? And didn't he practice the goetic thaumaturgy of the Lemegeton? Yes, but even Crowley wrote an excellent psychological introduction to Mather's translation of the Goetia, showing that he understood the subjective nature of the system. Neither he or his mentor knew the operative technique. Crowley spent many hours trying to conjure a spirit, the visible appearance in smoke over the triangle of art. Now, smoke is probably the worst hypnotic focal point anyone could imagine, but a pretty good medium for an experiment in telekinesis, a totally objective process. If Crowley had realized that the system was hypnotic, he probably would have used a crystal or a dark mirror, which this proper equipment results would have been achieved within 15 or 20 minutes of work. Why didn't he realize this? Mather's ignorance of the hypnotic factor is easier to understand. He was a quixotic medievalist who insisted on objectifying everything. He believed that the Key of Solomon was actually written by the biblical monarch himself. However, Crowley should have known better. Even so, I think that three factors may have combined to keep Crowley from discovering the real secret of Renaissance ceremonial magic. First, the prevailing opinion of the time in the area of phenomenology ran to the objective. Pseudoscientific causes, such as the ectoplasm of the spiritualists, and second, Crowley was a philosophical dualist, which thrust him toward objectified conceptions, even though he was less credulous than Mathers, and third, he was deeply into drugs, and such agents tend to activate their own unique effects, whereas ritual hypnosis is a more directed vehicle through which the magician can produce a desired effect in accordance with his will. What is hypnosis? What is hypnosis? Nobody really knows, but what we do know is several things about it. One thing we know, it isn't sleep. In the physical, blood pressure, etc., the hypnotic trance is more like the normal awake condition. Putting together several modern definitions of hypnosis, we can come up with something like this. Hypnosis is a state of heightened suggestibility in which the mind is totally centered on one idea to the exclusion of everything else, including sensory perception that are unwanted or distracting. By this definition, anyone who is really concentrating on something, like reading a book or even watching television, may be said to be in some state of hypnotic trance. They certainly are. Gurdjieff went so far as to suggest that most people are hypnotized most of the time. To achieve their potential, they had to become dehypnotized. The point is that any routine task can become hypnotic. Here in Southern California, for instance, we are all familiar with the freeway driving trance. There are also musical trances, dancing trances, etc. There may even be a general everyday living trance, as Gurdjieff intimated. These trances are all different, and they have different levels of intensity and sensory selection. If a person is deeply engrossed in a book, he may not hear the phone ring, whereas if he is listening to the radio with one ear, he may hear the phone. Hypnosis is a normal and common condition. It is the usual behavior associated with the deeper cataleptic and somnambulistic trances, which seem strange and mysterious. Hypnosis was known to be used in ancient Egypt, where magician priests officiated at sleep temples, in which sufferers of various afflictions were cured by visitations of the gods. More probably, While the patients were in a somnambulistic trance, Egyptian magicians hypnotized animals such as lions and cobras, and in India, the occult hypnotist first hypnotizes himself before operating on his subject. This is a most magical approach and very effective. It seems unknown outside of esoteric circles. From ancient times up to the 1840s, the phenomenon was thought to be the result of manipulation and transmission of life force, a subtle substance called spirit, or in the East, Kundalini. This concept is not as objective or as simplistic as it first appears. The great Renaissance magus Marsilio Ficino theorized that the flow of spirit by the rites of astrological magic improved the health and intellectual capabilities of the operator. Ficino did not extend his method to include influencing the spirit in others, which would have been as dangerous in his time, but such a capability is implicit in his theory. Many medieval and Renaissance magi solicited the intercession of angels and demons in what Daniel Walker calls transitive operations for or against others. Or before we assume that this practice is entirely dualistic and objectified, we should remember that these operators derived their philosophy from the Hermetic holy book known as the Asclepius, which plainly taught that angels, demons, and gods of the earth sphere were originally creations of man himself. The magicians of the Renaissance knew very well that such entities were subjective. We might even call their magical pantheism a proto-Jungian archetypal theory in its own right. They were also well aware of the powers of fascination, which they attributed to the rays of spirit directed from the eyes of the enchanter. These magicians were monistic in their philosophy. Subjective visions were as important as objective phenomenon. They can perhaps be criticized for not citing the difference between the two. The crystal ball and the dark speculum mirror were their most important items of ritual equipment. Their use was linked to theories of celestial rays, planetary sympathies, and the like, but the actual operations and effects achieved were hypnotic. And yet, in Victorian times, Arthur Edward Waite called such techniques minor hypnotic processes. How little he understood. Mesmerism. This spirit theory in magic and hypnosis was revived in a different form 300 years after Ficino by the Viennese physician Franz Anton Mesmer. He called it animal magnetism. In the age of reason, spirit could no longer be directed by the singing of Orphic hymns or the influence of appropriate planets. In the 1780s, demanded a pseudo-scientific approach. Although Mesmer was a keen student of the Renaissance alchemist Paracelsus and a believer in astrology, theorizing that the flow of magnetic fluid in the human body was affected by planetary positions, he succumbed to the 18th century passion for toot-whistle tinkering by having his subjects sit with their feet in tubs of water filled with iron filings and bundles of jointed iron rods, and with a flair for the dramatic and, according to his critics, a penchant for hocus pocus, Mesmer and his fellow magnetizers beguiled Europe for the next 50 years with their miracle cures and spectacular demonstrations of transcenduction. Mesmerism has been completely discredited by the magical profession and the scientific community. In my opinion, undeservedly. Because of its importance in magic, we should pause in our brief chronology to take note of how it differs from modern concepts of hypnosis. A current popular notion still hanging on from medical propaganda predating World War I is that the hypnotist has no power. He guides a willing subject into a trance state and then suggests that the subject use his own powers to achieve whatever effects is wanted, providing that effect is also desired by the subject himself. According to this conception, a snake hypnotizes a bird by first gaining the bird's confidence. Next, the snake asks the bird to relax completely. He then suggests to the bird that it actually wants to become the snake's dinner. This ploy cannot possibly succeed because deep down inside the bird knows that he wants to fly away from the snake. And yet snakes have been hypnotizing and eating birds for a good many years. A rejoinder that animals are different than humans is not good enough. The point is that there is a big gray area where some of Mesmer's ideas may still be valid. It is important to note that some psychologists who use hypnosis do not share such outdated views on its limitations. Men like Dr. Milton Erickson will frankly admit that they don't know what they do or how they do it. But many of Erickson's colleagues refuse to shake hands with him out of certain reluctance to experience his hypnotic touch. Now, I submit that there probably is a form of life energy that is capable of manipulation or even transmission. To totally discount the work of such sincere and qualified researchers as von Reichenbach, Odic Force, and Reich, Ogren Energy, and more recently Thelma Moss, Carillion Photography, and the biomagneticists on their subtle form of energy would be frankly reactionary and anathema in politics, but praiseworthy attitude in science. The mesmerists held that a magnetizer was a person of great energy with a talent for influencing others. He could accumulate and concentrate large quantities of energy in his body, projecting it from his eyes and his fingertips. His eyes could fascinate, and his hands could heal. The passes which the mesmerist made over his subject with his hands were intended to manipulate the flow of energy within the patient's body. We should note that Mesmer's method involved what we would call hysterical hypnosis. He brought his patients to an emotional catharsis and sometimes into convulsions in order to clear away supposed blockages in the free circulation of magnetic fluid in their bodies. We are reminded of today's primal scream therapy, a different rationale with a similar effect. In modern magical mesmerism, which such violent and hypnotic methods of induction are no longer used, we have discovered the actual contact with the fingertips increases the effect and produces the trance state of tremendous potential. The question still posed by mesmerists is, whatever hypnosis is only a suggestion operating on the individual nervous system, or if it also involves manipulation and transference of a form of energy. Science has not disproved this fluid theory. In spirit, of all the rhetoric to the contrary. What it did prove is that hypnosis can be effectively induced by suggestion without any pretense of transferred power. But to conclude that this therefore proves hypnosis to be exclusively a product of suggestion within the closed system of the individual with no transitive factor involved is patently fallacious. You can prove that ducks fly, but you have no right to assume as a consequence that they don't swim underwater. A return to our chronology, there is no doubt that mesmerists were effective. They fascinated half of Europe, but they easily infuriated the medical profession. Nothing bothers a doctor so much as a healer without a diploma. Even though Mesmer was an MD, many of his successors were laymen. Although some were rank charlatans, others were operators of considerable ability. Today's performing hypnotists are pale descendants of these wondrous magnetizers who could walk out on a stage and knock people senseless with a mere glance or a wave of the hand. In the early 1800s, mesmerism had the scientific community between the proverbial rock and a hard spot. The mesmerists were obviously doing something in accordance with some unknown natural law. But if their theory about manipulation of life force were to be accepted, then the whole philosophical structure upon which science was based would have to be scrapped. The scientists had their own form of dualism in the inevitable tendency toward objectification that accompanies it. In the 17th century, the French rationalist philosopher René Descartes had broken with the monistic conceptions of the Renaissance to propose that mind and body were totally separate. To carry it further, he postulated that the province of human intellect was separate from the realm of the physical universe. In higher philosophical circles, this idea was never considered more than a conditional expedient to facilitate the advancement of science and to counterbalance the obvious excesses of monism. But on the engineering level, it became holy dogma. Today it's philosophically obsolete, but we still find many people in the physical sciences clinging to it. And if you've ever wondered why certain spokesmen for the American science sound very much like other spokesmen for American religion, you consider how much the Cartesian dualism and Christian dualism have in common. In our field of hypnotism, this Cartesian myopia is responsible for the preposterous notion that hypnotic anesthesia is really amnesia. The patient feels the pain but forgets it. The scientists and physicians of the early Victorian era, realizing that mesmerism could not be ignored and could not be discredited as far as its actual effects were concerned, still found it impossible to accept on Cartesian terms. Somehow, they had to have a compromise. In the 1840s, a Scottish doctor, James Braid, provided it. He coined the modern term hypnosis and established the modern principles of hypnosis, hypnotic induction. Following the lead of the Abbé de Faria of 1755-1819, who had been a critic of Mesmer's magnetic fluid theory, Braid declared that the motive agent in hypnosis was the imagination of the subject. No magnetic devices, hand passes, dynamic powers were transmitted from the operator that were necessary to achieve a hypnotic trance and its unique effects. Of course, this was true, as Braid and others proved. We cannot say that they threw out the baby with the bathwater when they cleaned up hypnosis, but we can say that mesmerism is a different form of hypnosis, and that the two methods overlap each other. In this regard, we should note that Esther Brooks, 1917, cites a case of hypnotic subjects falling into hysterical convulsions Mesmer's magnetized patients experienced. I also think that there was an element of humbug in mesmerism that needed chucking out, the water tubs and the iron rods, etc. Even though Braid and his followers went to opposite extremes, reducing the awesome secret of the ancients to the harmless status of a verbalized aspirin tablet, their new form of therapy was, and still is, frowned upon by conservative doctors and scientists. No matter how harmless the hypnotist claims his method to be, he is initiating a direct influence of the mind over the body. This poses a threat to Cartesian dogma and elicits gut-level adverse reactions from a large segment of the scientific community even today. Now, frankly, I am pleased that hypnosis is still not accepted as a science. This is because it is not a science, and trying to conceptualize it in journal jargon terms is not going to make it one. Braid's monodeism and Van Pelt's 1957 more recent units of mind power are only labels for something no more understood in terms of physical science today than it was in the 1840s. However, there has been considerable progress in understanding hypnosis from a psychological standpoint. Now, psychological suggestibility, or the circulation of the force. Esther Brooks points out that in Freudian terms, hypnosis and autosuggestion, self-hypnosis, tend to function like early traumatic experiences in imprinting the subconscious mind. According to his theory, strong emotional experiences of a negative nature produce complexes and phobias in much of the same way that post-hypnotic suggestion causes the subject to react to a forgotten, intentionally suppressed stimulus in a manner he cannot explain. For example, when I snap my fingers, you will sing the national anthem. Vis-a-vis the person who goes into a historical fit at the sight of a harmless insect. Esther Brooks cites several analogies along this line. He likens the brain in this instance to a photographic plate on which emotional traumas or intense hypnotic suggestions make strong, overexposed impressions that do not fade out but continue to flash when activated by consciously perceiving triggering stimuli. This ingenious theory helps to explain the apparent dichotomy between magic and witchcraft. The ceremonialists stress measured hypnotic conjurations, whereas the witches favor the emotionally stimulating abandon of the circle dance. And yet, both achieve similar results. This is because both methods imprint the subconscious mind with the desired impression or release a specific suppressed component of the personality to be confected or controlled. And if we accept Dr. Esther Brooks' theory, and I do, as far as it goes, then we must realize that magic and witchcraft are powerful psychodynamic systems. Even in the exclusively subjective, phenomenologically conservative sense. The practice of the art and the craft is not as dangerous as our credulous Christian critics contend, but neither is it as frivolously dysfunctional as the Cartesian pedants would suppose. We are the initiators of a great ancient system of psychology, perfected over thousands of years, and it can bring much good and happiness to us and to our associates, or, like any of the major systems of knowledge, it can be misused with harmful effect. In magic and witchcraft, however, most malicious transitive operations tend to backfire, because the would-be sorcerer does not understand the subjective nature of the art. As valuable and important as the psychological aspects certainly are, let us not forget the force. And if you don't think it exists, just remember the last time you were at a sporting event. In any crowd of people where emotions run high, you were caught up in the excitement as you never would have been sitting in front of a TV. You are receiving an interchange of energy from the crowd, and granted, it may be a secondary interchange via synchronization of biorhythms, but it was a transitive link-up nonetheless. The negative side of the phenomenon is called mob reaction, wherein otherwise peaceful citizens become violent in the midst of an angry crowd. The black magic nadir of this syndrome would be Hitler's Nuremberg rallies, with the thousands of mindless stormtroopers shouting Sieg Heil. Hitler first hypnotized his subjects using the power of suggestion to open their subconscious minds and make them receptive. Then he raised their emotions to a historical pitch, creating what can best be described as mass mesmerism. Keeping the Nazis in mind, we would do well to consider the dangers of hypnosis and mesmerism. People certainly can be hypnotized against their will, and not merely by deception, as Esther Brooks suggests. Hypnotized subjects have committed murders and other crimes. The use of hypnosis in intelligence operations is common, and such thrillers as The Manchurian Candidate are not as fictional as they may seem. In occultism, we find the villain in the person of the unscrupulous hypnotist guru, who is always on the lookout for the one person in every dozen with the right combination of characteristics to make him or her an ideal victim. A natural capacity for somnambulism with a credulous attitude and a weak ego. 1 out of every 5 people can reach a somnambulistic trance state, the deepest level of hypnosis. This ability has nothing to do with the intelligence or character any more than having red hair does, but when combined with gullibility and the underdeveloped sense of identity, we have the psychological profile of the true believer. These people are the natural prey of the occult Svengali, and we can never fully protect them from exploitation, any more than we can eliminate poverty or crime, but we can substantially reduce the prestige of the shady operators who prey on them by establishing a genuine Western mystical tradition with recognized standards. Applying hypnosis to ritual magic. Having established that magic is a hypnotic process, and having examined the theories underlying that phenomenon, we are all ready to consider the practical application and technique. First, you have to establish an understanding of subjective hypnotic nature of magic with your students and lodge members. I strongly advise against initiating anyone who refuses to accept the concept. To underline this point, I will admit to having made the mistake and finding out that there is no convincing such a person afterward to abandon their objective view. You will only succeed in convincing him that you are a poor magician because you are unable to make the floor burst open and spill forth legions of Tartarus in cinemascope and stereophonic sound. In this case, rely on a good preliminary screening test rather than informal questioning. In cocktail party chatter, such a person may seem sophisticated, mentioning Jung and Crowley glibly, but then turn out to be a semi-literate barbarian in the lodge, and be warned. If you are fully honest about the hypnotic nature of magic and cannot avoid considering ethical considerations, all conjurations, pathworking scenarios, and invocations should be known and standardized. The more traditional they are, the better. Everybody operates and everybody receives in turn. There must be a cadre of adepti, but their job is to teach others to be operators, and as such, they should operate only with members of their own level or for instructive purposes. In ceremonial magic, everyone should have their turn at taking every role in the temple rites, seasonal ceremonies, and initiations. Otherwise, a magical lodge can become a cult in the worst sense of the word. There is much self-hypnosis, autosuggestion involved in magic, and as that currently induced by an operator, in fact, self-hypnosis may be considered the practical key to developing the magical trance state. The Order of the Temple of Astarte insists that neophytes master self-hypnosis as soon as possible. We recommend Leslie M. Lecron's Self-Hypnotism, the Technique and Use in Daily Living, as the basic text. Frankly, no one has any business participating in a magical operation, with the exception of seasonal ceremonies, who is not capable of putting himself into a trance state and maintaining it. It is this ability which can be acquired only through training and practice. That enables the magician to carry out the complex maneuvers required in a formal operation and still be able to hold his trance. He can quickly deepen the state or bring himself up to normal consciousness when necessary. The reader may be thinking that yoga students and Zen masters can also do this, but I would not agree. Their trance states are closely associated with sedentary asana positions, and induction of the trance is less controlled and direct. It is, in fact, a byproduct of the meditation rather than the principal effect. I do not mean to imply that yoga and techniques are not important in magic, or that yoga and magical hypnosis are not interrelated. One of the first techniques the magical student has to learn is the practice of Tradikam, the fixed gaze. This is a hypnotic facet of yoga meditation wherein the student develops the ability to stare at a fixed object or symbol for long periods of time without blinking or letting the eyes go out of focus. This ability is absolutely essential to future Almadil and Goetic operations. A noted anthropologist once wrote that shamans could be recognized by their agitated manner and shifty glance. If he applied this to magicians, he could not have been more wrong. A magician looks right through you and never blinks. No one can stare him down except another magician. Before going any further, we should dispel the idea that magical hypnosis implies a similarity to the post-hypnotic demonstrations of stage hypnotism. If that concept applied, an operator would hypnotize his subjects and then instruct them, as in the analogy of the fellow singing the national anthem, to see a spirit in the triangle when he says keyword tetragrammaton. Now, granted, such a procedure would probably work, and it might have some value in an experimental sense, but it is not the way the art is practiced. It would be a gimmicky approach at best, and at worst, it would raise serious ethical questions. What I am saying is that ritual magic is a type of hypnosis in its own right, and it has been my observation, having operated and received and otherwise assisted in several hundred such ceremonial operations, that a magical trance state is unique. In clinical hypnosis, it is supposed that a somnambulistic state is necessary for visions to be seen and voices to be heard by a hypnotized subject. In Goetia evocation, however, a trained ritualist receiver can quickly drop from a light hypnoidal trance down into a receptive mood where he can appreciate the manifestation of the entity in the speculum and communicate with it, allow it to speak through him, and also answer the operator's questions in his own persona. His own remarks will be interspersed with the entity's comments, depending upon the operator's addresses, and he receives the entity. And the ritualist can do all this while standing up as an active participant in a group ceremony. It is important to note that such rituals do not depend on the use of drugs or hysterical dancing preliminary to the experience. Before any magic working is undertaken, there should be a period of preliminary meditation. This is also a hypnotic proceeding, usually led by the operator for the coming operation. It is best done outside the temple in an antechamber with a suitable atmosphere and dim lighting. In the OTA, we like to sit in a circle around a candle, sit upon an appropriate mandala, and we hold hands and establish a rhythmic breathing pattern in unison. Then the Magus leads us into a reverie wherein we absorb the imagined light of the Kabbalistic sphere or psychic center in which we will be working. When this experience reaches its peak, we rise and move into the temple, maintaining the set. The preliminary meditation serves several purposes. The vital transition stage between the mundane world and the sacred dimension of the inner sanctum within the temple, and in a temporal sense, it leads smoothly from real time into dream time. And if it reestablishes what we think of as the group mind of the lodge, and in this respect, it may be said to be mesmeric, and in an exchange of energy is initiated the power to be raised. Magical operations. As most readers know, there are three basic types of magical operations. Evocation, wherein the operator calls up the spirit from his or his receiver's subconscious. Invocation, wherein a supernatural power is called down to indwell in the subconscious. And interplane projection, pathworking, soul travel, wherein a journey is made into realms of the subconscious, and in this case, the collective unconscious, healing, the building of talismanic images, and the charging of talismans, and even the divination in variations on these themes. The grand operations may be said to be directly hypnotic, whereas the lesser workings tend to be post-hypnotic. Of these grand operations, magical pathworking is the most overtly hypnotic in its induction technique. Here, the operator induces a trance in much the same way as a doctor would hypnotize a patient in his office. The pathworkers lie on the floor of the temple with their heads on pillows in the center of the magic circle, and they look at a symbolic focal point overhead while they are told to relax and make themselves comfortable. Once their heavy eyelids close in hypnotic sleep, the operator conducts them via a descriptive narration on a tour of the sphere of the Kabbalistic tree of life along one of the subjective paths leading from Malkuth upward. The traditional symbolism of these paths and spheres is set forth in Gareth Knight's A Practical Guide to Kabbalistic Symbolism, 1965. That's still in print, by the way. But remember, this is a reference book and not a manual on pathworking. For an example of a pathworking scenario, you may consult the same author's New Dimensions Red Book, edited by Basil Welby, 1968. And that is probably no longer in print. And Gareth Knight is Basil Welby's magical pen name. The method is to create a consistent, realistic fantasy land, which will include all the symbolism we wish to encounter. Something like visiting Alice's Wonderland. One of the most common mistakes made would-be operators who have written their own scenarios is to take us along the path, showing us everything as if we were on a ride in Disneyland. This amounts to little more than an entertainment and really can't compete with a good movie. The purpose of the path is to learn more about it and yourself. And that will bring something up from your subconscious that will help you along the road to individuation. The way we do this is in the OTA's pathworking system is to establish attention points. These attention points are situations, objects, or entities that we are instructed to question individually and privately or otherwise comprehend. We are told to remember the special knowledge we have received. And later, in the critique, which always follows any magical operation, we are asked to recount what we have experienced. Some of these revelations are remarkable and often confirm our contention that the collective unconscious is truly a transpersonal dimension. As long as we stick to traditional symbolism in pathworking, we are towing the mark, as in the ethics department. But if we venture off into realms of our own capricious devising, taking our hypnotized lodge members along with us as we explore the dark regions of our own subconscious, we are abusing their trust and imposing upon them unpredictable dangers. Avoid the magus who has created his own revealed system, for it will inevitably reflect the particular imbalances of his own personality. There is a more subtle danger which may be encountered even in traditional working. The operator himself is in a light state of trance, as he would be in any magical operation, and is subject to impromptu visionary experiences. He should not involve his group in such phenomenon and should banish it or extricate himself as quickly as possible. If the scenario is properly written and revised, this should not be too much of a problem. Always remember in magic that the general laws of hypnosis apply. Keep your narration simple and carefully structured so you will not prematurely evoke a vision that will contradict with subsequent description. For example, Denning and Phillips published a pathworking script which contained the following passage. Some little distance ahead of us stands a solitary arch, built of flints by men of some past age. The keystone of this arch is of a pale granite, sparkling with myriad points of translucent white fire, and carved deeply upon this keynote is an emblem of the curling horns of a ram. Now, this is beautiful symbolism written in fine literary style, but as a hypnotic scenario, it is inappropriately sequenced and confusing. As soon as the operator says, some distance ahead of you stands a solitary arch, his subjects are quickly constructing arches, Gothic arches, classical arches, megalithic arches, all of which have to be torn down and rebuilt as the description continues. I don't think we have to belabor this point. Romantic poetry and elegant prose are excellent mediums for evoking images in the light level of the reading trance, but when we go into the somnambulistic depths, we have to keep our instructions simple and direct. Thus far, we have discussed hypnotic techniques in relation to Tradakam, evocation, preliminary meditation, and pathworking. It remains for us to consider invocation. This type of work is usually done on the double cube altar in the center of the great circle with a crystal orb as the focal point. In our Lemegeton system, we derive invocational rituals from the book Almadel. In the interest of maximum participation, we favor the round-robin sequence of invocations. Each member of the circle reaches for his own rendition of the invocation. With trained magicians, this group working actually intensifies the result, even though there is a teeter-totter effect in the trance depth of each one's rises from passive to active participation in turn. Now, this should underline the necessity for hypnotic training. In this article, I have taken off my magician's cloak and talked to you, the reader, in a straightforward manner as I can about a subject that few people understand. Of those who are more than casually interested, some can never be enlightened because, quite frankly, they don't want to be. I am not concerned with them, except to put them on notice that we are going to make our high art of magic into a cultural expression that we can all be proud of. And if they try to impede us in this process, we will not hesitate to discredit them. And yet, there is danger in too much dissembling. We can become intellectual and sophisticated with much dissembling, and we can become so intellectually and sophisticated that we lose our own sense of wonder, diminishing the light of intuition that leads us on. I hope I have at least hinted at the philosophical key to avoiding such a trap, the grand Hermetic monism of the Renaissance. If we emulate them in audacity, vision, and style, we shall surely delight children of all ages, especially the child that dwells within us in our subconscious. We should establish canons of magic in terms of Kabbalistic philosophy, Jungian psychology, and hypnotic practice, for those are the three pillars upon which the art stands today. We need to develop magic as the bright cutting edge of a new romantic movement to rejuvenate our culture. There is no place in such a sublime endeavor for the charlatan or the mystic demagogue. Magic should develop the ego and the willpower of each individual who practices it. Becoming devotees of a guru may be a valid Eastern practice, but it is the antithesis of the great work in the West. If hypnosis is our operative method, then we must insist on the highest standards of integrity in magical practice. The power is awesome, and the reward is infinite, as man may conceive, for whatever he envisions usually comes to pass. Now let me make some ending comments. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to read the footnotes, the explanatory footnotes on this article here. In the intervening 10 years since this article first appeared, this situation has not improved as much as I would have hoped. I am left to assume that those who make the marketing decisions in occult publishing houses have determined that hypnosis is a negative selling point with the essential credulous customer base. But we are slowly gaining ground. My colleague, Philip H. Farmer, has written a fascinating paper on the subject, Neuro-Linguistic Programming, Hypnosis, and Ritual Magic, for Paradigm Magazine. And the next footnote. This is correct in Kabbalistic sense. Yesod, and that's the lunar sphere, being the gateway to the Yetzirah, or the formative dimension. However, from a standpoint of actual practice, we require that the student evoke all four archangels of the quarters as protective and balancing components before undertaking goetic operations. And I mentioned we also should access the 72 Shemam Farash angels, which are the angelic counterparts of the Goetia. And the next footnote, a currently annotated version of negative and positive hypnosis. Yes, the essay Negative and Positive Hypnosis, which we will also record, this certainly should be consulted. In recent years, counter-reaction against Carl Jung's ideas has become fashionable. A dirt-digging biography by Frank McLean attempts to discredit Jung's position in the history of Western ideas. Based on his extramarital adventures, a former Jungian admirer and avid promoter of Jungian rites, Richard Knoll, experienced a sudden change of heart, not uncommon among cult devotees, and wrote 2 books scathing life and work of his mentor with yellow journalistic fervor. Both these authors have capitalized on the unfortunate fact that Carl Jung, like Pope Pius, did not lie down across the tracks of an onrushing Nazi train before World War II. For an extensive and corrective critique on these anti-Jungian works, see Robin Robertson's review in Gnosis magazine, winter 1998. For a clearer perspective on Jung and his ideas, see The Undiscovered Self and the Modern Man in Search of a Soul. And let me add to that Llewellyn published a rehabilitating article on Jung, but then Llewellyn Publications turned against Jung. And I'm not going to carry this argument further. The biologist Rupert Sheldrake has stirred an anthill of mechanistic biological dogma with his revolutionary morphic resonance theory. At the risk of vast oversimplification, let us say that Sheldrake proposes something similar to Eliphas Levi's idea of the astral light, in which all things and life processes are recorded. This dovetails with both Neoplatonic and Kabbalistic conceptions of preforms on the higher plane of emanation, the Olam Yetzerim. Sheldrake is sympathetic to Jung's collective unconscious theory, but he disagrees with Jung that its components are necessarily inherited. This morphological field is not thought to be an energy-driven process, but rather an imprint or template which exerts its influence throughout the universe and can be accessed via the deep mind. See A New Science of Life by Rupert Sheldrake. Sheldrake is important. We certainly should include him in this study. Now, 50 years previous to this, Eliphas Levi, whom Crowley claimed as a previous incarnation, attempted a similar experiment to summon the shade of Apollonius of Tyana. Quite properly, he used a mirror as a conjuration device, but he mistakenly thought that smoke on the altar would provide a substance for the spirit to use in building the visible form. He was successful, at least in his visualization, but vanished before attempting communication. Today, we use smoke before the dark mirror as an olfactory correspondence and a mood enhancer. Concentration stays on the mirror, not the smoke. We, of course, use the old facial reflection, what is now called the Troxler effect. A comparison to Taoist theories of qi comes to mind, and manipulation of this life force energy through the body via meditation and acupuncture techniques is now widely known, but such practices were not known to Europeans in the 10th century, and weren't very well known either to Age of Enlightenment by Mesmer. This statement needs some clarification. Actually, Arthur Edward Waite was aware of the hypnotic nature of magical vision and said so. Much of what he did not understand was the importance of dark mirrors and crystals as hypnotic conjuration devices. Now, in this case, I'm referring to the OTA's assumption of goddess form. This is our mesmeristic technique, which you can read in the Book of Solomon's Magic. That's where we prove that mesmerism is still part of magic. The method of conjuration in which the receiver lies under a dark mirror while being lightly massaged by the operator and his assistants. For a detailed description of this, see Chapter 10 in the Book of Solomon's Magic. However, there have been considerable research in trance states, alpha, beta, theta, etc., and sleep state REM, rapid eye movement. A lot of research in this lately. Along with the biofeedback systems and developments in neurolinguistics. But all this work, as valuable as it may be, merely refines our ability to employ a phenomenon we still don't understand. And if you want to see a wonderful demonstration of the 1, 2, 3 neurolinguistic effect, go watch Orson Welles' Black Magic from 1949. And when he has his audience with the king, he does the 1, 2, 3 on these aristocrats that are trying to discredit him. It's really fun to watch. Okay. This is especially true when the operator uses facial reflection distortion, mirror method spiritification. The reason is implicit in the microcosm hermetic model of the human psyche. We are all differing reflections of the same primordial Adam and Eve, and lightning will strike the nearest target. From a strictly psychological point of view, we can surmise that ordering a reflected image of yourself, no matter how distorted, to reach out and hurt another person would result in related collateral damage to yourself closer to home. You can't use these methods for black magic for hurting other people. You just can't, because you're going to hurt yourself. This statement needs to be carefully qualified. The idea, popular in the 1950s, that anyone can be broken or reprogrammed by a brainwashing, which derived from Pavlov's stimulus response experiments in Russia and B.F. Skinner's behaviorism in the U.S., came in for sound drubbing by structural linguist Noam Chomsky. Chomsky demolished Skinner's theory that the brain was a blank state at birth, and that all human knowledge acquisition was stimulus-response driven. He proved that there was an innate grammar structure for a grammar born in all of us. Brainwashing of the North Korean Pax Palace Manchurian candidate variety will only work with borderline personality subjects, and it's no more reliable with the borderline personalities themselves, who, by the nature of their condition, are subject to sudden snapping or reversal of affections. Although no longer considered practical for black covert operations, brainwashing is still dangerous in the hands of cult leaders who seek out borderline personalities. Cult mass suicides are a grim testimonial to the legacy of Pavlov and Skinner. However, Chomsky did not escape from spawning a new and more subtle form of mind manipulation, which is not limited to special personalities. Today, brainwashing has given way to the far more persuasive, or if you prefer, insidious, neurolinguistics. I am not aware of any studies suggesting a link between natural somnambulism and borderline personality syndrome, and I am not suggesting that such a connection exists. The more pointed example of this one-sided Svengaliism was a student of mine who absolutely refused to enter a trance state himself, but was most eager to use the dark mirror Goetia technique to beguile others, especially young women. In 1972, he left the OTA and went on to establish a reputation as a sorcerer at Lodge. And since that time, several of his students have found their way back to the original fount of his knowledge. The OTA was first, 1977, Western Occult Lodge to adopt its fully functional Kabbalistic non-sphere vertical chakra system, the essential aspect of high magic so important to Eastern practice, that's been denied to European practitioners for a result of their obsession to objectify and concretize spiritual reality. How the Tibetans must have pitied us. They have a different chakra system for each tantric entity they employ. For a brief review of the description of the OTA, see the Hermetic Hour. We have published 2 volumes on Hermetic Yoga, and I highly recommend both of them. When we say traditional, we mean Golden Dawn traditional, based on the rabbinical structure of the 19th century GD system. It incorporates tarot symbolism, pagan mythological archetypes, and has become standard for most students in Western magic. The OTA system was inspired by soul travel methods of Sikh Sant Guru Kripal Singh, also the mentor of Paul Twitchell, who developed Ikankar. We Kabbalized the attention point pathworking method with the monist philosophy and subjective approach, and Eastern magical methods translate easily and effectively into Western practice in most cases. And of course, our pathworkings really derive more from Gareth Knight's practical symbolism to Kabbalistic symbolism than they do really to Ikankar or Kripal Singh. In angelic Almadale operations, it is not necessary to actually see a personage or symbolic vision in the crystal. A radiant glory on the altar top and a sense of spiritual presence, and channeling the entity speaking through the receiver or subjective knowledge. And here again, see the Book of Solomon's Magick. And that concludes the footnotes on Magick and Hypnosis. Now, we've got this follow-up article, Negative versus Positive Gnosis, which we will present as soon as we get that recorded. And so, come back again next week, and good magic.